Morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Joe Dabrowski. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy here at the PLSA. Delighted that you're with us today. Responsible investment and climate issues have been a big theme for us throughout the years and for many years, in fact, in all sorts of areas. We expect it to continue to be an important area for us going forward, and you could expect to see a lot more. We've been delighted during this year to be working with A4S on various things, including trustee training and awareness. Given the big challenges that we all have, it's really important that we all work collaboratively to kind of up our game, up our skills, share best practice and knowledge. More important, in particular, where we've got an area where is evolving rapidly, both in practice and kind of on the regulatory front. Today, in particular, we're going to be looking at how do you ensure your service providers have got the right capabilities, how do you understand kind of where to start in assessing them, what you can do to kind of embed some of those processes into your day-to-day. It's not always easy, and I think it's important that we start kind of recognizing that those challenges, but also looking to those like Brian and Denise who are with us today, who are kind of pathfinders really for us. They're doing a lot of work. They've been doing this for a while. They're leading the way, and kind of what they can tell us and how we can learn from them is really, really important. I'm delighted that we've got with us today Kerry Perkins. Kerry's Head of Capital Markets at A4S. Denise Legal, Chair of the Brunel Pensions Partnership. And for those of you who are less familiar, that's one of the pools in the LGPS. Brian Kilpatrick, CIO of HSBC Pension Scheme. So I'm going to hand over to Kerry, and Kerry's going to lead us with our fireside discussion on this slightly chilly morning. And please do put your questions through the chat, and we'll look forward to coming back to you in due course. Thank you, Kerry. Over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and morning, everyone. Great to be here. So as Joe said, I'm Kerry. I head up our capital markets within Accounting for Sustainability, also known as A4S. A4S was founded by the Prince of Wales back in 2004, and our mission statement is to make sustainable decision-making business as usual. Before we move into our fireside chat, as Joe said, just to give a bit of context, as the dust settles on the COP26 process, the eyes of the world are on governments, companies, and the financial sector to push forward and expand on pledges that have been made. Structures like the newly formed Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, which announced a total of $130 trillion of private capital through membership, we will start to see them reporting on progress in a structured and yearly way. So we will see processes and methods adapt over the coming years. However, in the meantime, the more that industries can learn from each other and build a collective pool of knowledge, the stronger these individual organizations will be in the face of change, both transitional change and adaptation change due to the climate crisis. So this session, as Joe says, will be looking at the practical steps that trustees and executives can take to ensure that their service providers are delivering their schemes' ESG objectives. And I'm delighted to be joined by two member schemes of A4S's Asset Owners Network, which is made up of 30 chairs of pension schemes, their investment committees and pooling partners. So I welcome both Denise Legal, or I second welcome, I should say, after Joe. We're doing double welcomes today. Denise Legal of Brunel Pension Partnership and Brian Kilpatrick, CIO of the HSBC Bank Pension Scheme, and invite them to share with us how they are approaching the engagement with their service providers. So kicking off, before we get into the details, it would be good to hear from both of you on the COP26 summit, your thoughts on this. Both managing 30 plus billion assets, what for you were the key takeaways from the summit? Were you encouraged, disappointed? Did it cement some of your approaches? Denise, if I could start with you.
COP26 was a bit of a mixed bag for us. It won't necessarily change the actions that we're already taking at Brunel in terms of how we invest in pushing for change in the real economy. But there was some disappointment for many that it didn't go far enough. There was no big bang moment. But I think I'd like to stress some of the positives. This was the largest climate summit ever with unprecedented private sector participation and some 200 countries coming together for a common cause. Now, what a diplomatic challenge that represents. And after some 6 years of negotiations, governments have agreed on the rule book to implement the Paris Agreement, hopefully paving the way to be able to trade emissions rights internationally through carbon markets. Overall, that represents a subtle shift from negotiation to action. The surprise announcement between China and the US to boost their climate cooperation was encouraging. The agreement to come back to future COPs, including COP27, was promising and a sign for more things to come and to maintain momentum. There was greater language to a firmer commitment down the line. There was a sense of that we were at a societal tipping point and heightened consciousness for those who will suffer most, but sadly, the desire to have industrialized countries provide the $100 billion each year for reparations was not entirely reached. But there were several other smaller signs of progress, such as 100 countries signing to end deforestation by 2030, pledges to stop new extractions, reducing methane emissions, phasing out of coal. That was a bit disappointing, but nonetheless, this is to name a few. Does it get us to net zero? No. At best, we have policy pledges, and again, assuming that these are implemented, that range from 2.4 to 2.7 degrees by 2030 and 1.8 to 2.1 degrees by 2050. There's a lot more work to be done and to be done urgently. But progress has been made. And I'll end by quoting Dr. Henry Kissinger, who rather aptly described diplomacy as the quiet accumulation of partial victories. And I think that sums up COP26 in a nutshell.
I agree with you, Denise. Brian, do you have anything to add on your thoughts around COP26?
No, I completely agree. It was momentum. It was positive. It was good to see the commitments to meeting emissions reduction and deforestation. Very welcome. It's a bit of a shame that the around coal, the consensus didn't go far enough. And I agree completely with Denise that Climate Action Tracker is saying we're somewhere between 1.8 and 1.4. But positively, countries did commit to come back to the COP next year in Egypt with more enhanced targets. So the momentum is gathering. It won't change what we're doing either. We've got firm commitments to be net zero by 2050, and we've got 2030 interim targets, and we're working towards that. But it does feel that there is momentum now. And when I speak to asset managers, they are now firmly focused on this. Maybe 5-10 years ago, the less so. And so I think the world is beginning to change and momentum is building. We just have to make sure it's ingrained and it's embedded in business as usual portfolio management.
Yeah, and onto that point, moving specifically then onto engaging your asset managers. Denise, Brunel has publicly committed to a 50% reduction in your carbon emissions by 2030 and to net zero by 2050 at the latest. What measures are you putting in place to ensure that your asset managers help you achieve this goal?
Yeah, well, not just for ourselves, but for them as well. You have to have interim targets as well as longer term ones. So our 2030 targets translate into a 7% annual reduction in carbon exposure, which I think is the common thread. And some years might be more, some might be less, but it's important that we monitor that and that we measure. So we monitor all our portfolios and managers for their performance in this specific area. And it's one of our make or break issues for who we hire or fire. And in terms of the detail, we have a carbon metrics report on our website that shows all the exposure of our active holdings and tracks our broader progress. And we also publish an annual outcomes report. And as of this year, a climate action plan, which incorporates the TCFD methodology.
Okay, and Denise, you mentioned there about how integral it is to the procurement stage. Could you go into a little bit more detail about the practical steps that you've taken to embed the need for ESG integration across your tender process, your procurement process?
Yeah. Well, when speaking with portfolio managers about responsible investment, we look at whether they talk about responsible investment in a generic sense, or whether they can demonstrate that they've integrated all the environmental, social, and governance factors into the specific asset classes or the products they're showing us. So we look at their there's a lot of narrative here, not just metrics, but we do look at their PRI assessment reports, whether they are involved in initiatives such as Climate Action 100, and we ask for examples of specific engagements specific to the product that we're considering. And we also consider responsible investment at a fund management company level. We don't just look at the portfolio. We want to see some overlap between our philosophy and the manager's philosophy, as that can be an indicator of how willing they are to form a partnership with us and the extent to which they will listen if we disagree on an issue. It's really important to determine the culture of the company, as that helps us to evaluate whether a manager lives out their stated commitments to the risk regulatory and decision-making standards and processes and its investment, responsible investment principles. And that permeates through all our portfolios, including passive ones.
Okay, and on that point, are there any particular pinch points that help you identify that culture, as you were talking around the asset manager, to ensure that they do align?
Yeah, they do have to show us that their due diligence incorporates RI rather than just treating it as an add-on.
Yeah.
So we look at their other funds and whether their supposed RI principles can be seen to be applied to those other funds too, not just the one we're investing in. So a holistic approach to how they're treating it. And we also take the interview when we're interviewing them for selection. That is very serious. The fund manager who just looks over to their RI person when we're asking any RI questions could be giving away that RI is tangential to their process. And also, of course, RI is the part of a regular reporting obligations back to us that we insist upon.
Okay, great point. And then Brian, the HSBC bank scheme has recently announced the same commitment in terms of targeting a 50% reduction in your carbon emissions by 2030 and achieving net zero by 2050 or sooner. How will this commitment change the way you engage with asset managers, and why? Will it change?
So I think the engagement process will change quite materially, in the sense that we are now, so we've published a TCFD statement for the last 4 years, but we're now making what is reporting information in TCFD management information, to the extent that we're now building what we call manager scorecards, portfolio by portfolio, looking at the highest emitters in each portfolio and what percentage of total emissions they represent. And in some respects, it's unsurprising. It does correlate highly with the Climate Action 100 plus focus list of companies. For those who are not familiar with it, it essentially identifies 160 odd companies that account for over 80% of corporate greenhouse gas emissions. So we're now able to use that to go and speak to our fund managers, identify those companies that are responsible for highest emissions, assess why our fund managers think that's a good investment, and more importantly, I think, than their emissions, which is a past-looking number, looking at their alignment with Paris goals, and are they going to get to net zero when we want to get to net zero, and if not, why? And I think that's quite a powerful use of information, because it does focus the engagement with fund managers on those key companies, and then the conversation is about how frequently do you engage with them, how do you identify engagement goals, how do you define success of engagement, and if success isn't achieved, what do you want to do about that? And so that then drives forward into stewardship as well, in terms of how fund managers vote for equity portfolios, obviously. And it does change the focus, and it changes the focus for us. We want engagement now to be defined in terms of success criteria and outcomes, and we want reporting to be focused on that. so that it's not just a tick box exercise, it's actually something that you do and you want productive outcomes to flow from it.
Could you expand a little bit more on the stewardship expectations of your asset managers and how you ask them to behave and report, for example, on the voting side? And also, Brian, do you have an opinion on this proposal that's been out recently around proposed by the task force on pension scheme voting implementation on expression of wish idea, i.e. the idea for the asset owner to present an expression of wish around voting to their asset managers?
Yeah, so we did support that initiative to be for asset owners to be able to convey an expression of wish to asset managers and pooled fund space, and we really would like that to be embedded in the stewardship process itself. It's a difficult debate, I think, because some fund managers really believe that being able to vote in the way they want to is fully aligned with how they manage portfolios. But nevertheless, I still think that as asset owners, we should be able to express our view on how we think the companies that we own shares in should be able to communicate to the board what we think is good corporate citizenship behaviour. But in terms of the process of overall engagement, I take it back to what's the purpose of engagement and what's the purpose of being an owner of capital in companies themselves. And we as an asset owner believe we are a good corporate citizen, and we want the companies we invest in to exhibit those behavioural traits, and as much as we can influence them to exhibit those behaviours, we think it's a legitimate way of expressing the long-term financial interests of our members. And I think it's important to differentiate here between ethics and ESG risk management. We're all about ESG risk management and engaging with companies to protect the long-term interests of our members. Ethics, in some respects, is beauty is now the beholder, and we're not in that space. It's about risk management, and it's interesting over the time I've been in this industry, risk management has now become much more expansive, and it's not a narrow financial definition anymore. It's much wider. It's societal, and it's governance, and it's the long-term interests of pension scheme members.
On that point then, Brian, do you see the future role of asset owners being much more proactive around the stewardship side as opposed to relying on their asset managers to do that?
Yes, I do, and I think you just have to look at the DWP consultation that's out at the moment, which in a sense is obligating asset owners to be much more proactive in terms of stewardship, and not just delegating it to fund managers and having statements and SIPs saying delegate voting to fund managers. There is a challenge there, and regulators are moving more and more to make, I think, asset owners be much more proactive and owners of that stewardship question, and not just delegating to other organisations to express a view.
And mindful that you two represent quite big organisations here, I'm over to you, Denise. What kind of messages would you give smaller schemes around the idea that stewardship is so important for them to handle directly?
Yeah,
as well?
I'm very conscious of the strain on resources for smaller schemes. So collaboration is really at the heart of the answer to that question, and they can take a nudge from some of those that have including Brunel, who have gone through and worked very closely with regulators. Actually, we worked very closely with both with DWP and the FRC on the stewardship code, and we continue to be on the Occupational Pension Stewardship Board. We publish our stewardship policy and our climate policy. All of these things we are available online for anyone to use, and for smaller schemes, they should have that, and they should have a voting policy. Recognizing that the expression of wish is quite a complex and nuanced, depending on on several factors. And for smaller schemes in particular, you know, what type of scheme is it? Does it have trustees? Is it farmed out to an insurer? So who has actual leadership in the right to vote? And as Brian had said, you know, it depends who you're talking to. Some fund managers see the voting as their right. You know, they see it as potentially a cost, can see it as a cost burden, for example. The task force, I don't think they really expect the schemes to give extremely precise expressions. They see it as more as a tool where instructions at the strategic and policy level can be said. So if service providers are as client-centric as they often claim, they will facilitate it. But you know, it's really important for a scheme to have a voting policy. So I would say that, and if you have a voting policy that is very clear, you know, you may not necessarily have to have an expression of wish. But in terms of Brunel, we do most of our voting through as an external provider, EOS Hermes. But we have, in our agreement with them, there's a mechanism and a process whereby we can vote differently if we're not aligned on a particular vote. And, you know, we're also heavily involved with other groups like Climate Action 100, as I mentioned earlier. But we don't want to just punish the bad guys. We want the industry to transform itself. And that's a much bigger challenge, particularly for the smaller schemes. So my advice to them would be just borrow it from those who've already done it and who have a good track record.
Thank you, Denise. And I think the message that you said around learning from others is great. And maybe Joe would be able to bring up the resources that Denise mentioned. Also, A4S's ESG toolkit for chairs and trustees. It features various case studies that covers the stewardship. So basically peer-focused case studies that looks at the what, why, how, and the top tips from those pension schemes on particular elements, including stewardship. And just lastly, on the asset manager side, Brian, just carrying on the theme about any kind of top tips or key steps that you can suggest that others can take, no matter the size or scale of the scheme, on ensuring that asset managers help to fulfill your net zero commitments.
Yeah, it is a challenge. You know, I've worked with large schemes and very small schemes, and I understand the resource constraints that the smaller schemes live with. But I would focus on the following issues. Excuse me. I'd engage with asset managers, ask them about net zero targets, whether they have one or not, and if they don't have one, why not? How are they going to measure that over year by year progression? And does it align with a net zero in 2050? Ask your asset managers how they assess companies being aligned with a net zero target, because that's quite a difficult question. There's no standard metric in the market yet that measures alignment going forward. But if asset managers are serious about investing in companies that might be high emitters now, they need to, I think, have a valid reason to do that and to manage that real economy reduction going forward to make sure that net zero is going to happen. Our asset managers, organisations, members of organisations that we all know and care about, like UNPRI, are the signatories to the UK Stewardship Code, assess the scores, as Denise said earlier. How do they participate in these organisations? Are they worthwhile members? Are they contributing? And going back to what Denise said earlier, how do they integrate genuine ESG research into the work that they're doing with underlying companies? I think these are all key questions. And are they thought leaders? Are they offering you as trustees good training on ESG integration? Are they challenging you to think about it and how you then take that training away with other asset managers? There's a whole list of, I think, what is quite low-hanging fruit that could be picked to make sure that they actually grasp the concept and are demonstrating good practice.
I think that's great, Brian. Thank you. So, you know, ask what the net zero target is, how to measure it, how they're involved in other like-minded organisations, how to integrate it into the stewardship, like you said, and what is their thought leadership position on this, if any, and the training they did. So Thank you for that. Now moving on to investment consultants. Denise, can you tell us a bit about the way in which Brunel works with investment consultants to define your sustainable investment philosophy and strategy, and also obviously to assess the performance of asset managers and the funds?
Well, it's a little bit of a long and winding road, I have to say. There has been a lot of progress in recent years, and currently many of them have caught up and have, are not just, dare I say, using it as a way to get more work rather than a genuine integrated philosophy and strategy for their clients. And there was a lot of worry about, suggesting portfolios, etc., various things, benchmarks, etc., that may not really have been changing anything. And the thinking around that is evolving as well. And I have to go back to asset managers to make this point. So, for example, one asset manager we work with, they have been very involved in electronic cars, and now they're thinking, in the development of EV, and now they're thinking as well, actually mobility is changing globally. Do we really want to produce, are we really thinking about producing more and more and more electric cars, or is the way we move and we have mobility, will that change? And so in that sort of thinking, that's really important for us as asset owners, because we want to invest in companies for the future. And also, just at a purely philosophical level, we won't address climate unless we consume less, because the demand is so strong and it continues to grow. Our whole financial thinking has been based on growth and based on expansion, when actually maybe we need to start thinking a different way. Do we really want to just continue to grow and consume more? And should we be investing in companies that may do less, and that it's not just entirely focused on profit? So that's at the heart of our thinking. Whether our investment consultants are thinking along those ways, I think it might start, but I see it more with asset managers at the moment than with consultants. Now, they have a place. They really help us a lot when we do due diligence, because our due diligence process when appointing new managers is quite stringent. And so it requires a huge amount of resource, but we set out right from the outset what that process would be. And they really help us just to test whether the fund managers are living up to what they're saying they're living up to. So we do work with them, but we do challenge them. We don't just accept necessarily that their investment philosophy and strategy are at the sharp edge of where we are today. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit there, Kerry.
No, because by asking more of those kind of wide-reaching questions then about the longer-term ideology of where we're going to be on things like mobility. So asking kind of quite abstract exam questions helps kind of test their thinking and their reach.
Yeah.
Would that be? And Brian, then on the same subject, how do you as a pension scheme ensure that they know what they're talking about?
It's a very, very challenging question, I think. And inevitably, it's a mixture of subjective and objective measures. But the key things I look for in an investment consultant is, so the individual who's your investment consultant, are they able to meaningfully contribute to trustee discussions and show thought leadership as a person? But more broadly, does that organisation demonstrate thought leadership? As again, I mentioned it earlier, but are they publishing good material that is insightful and educational? Do they offer seminars to help you as clients learn in this space? do they challenge asset managers and encourage better integration of ESG in the investment process? And one of the most insightful things that I like to do is, if you're looking for a new asset manager, then sit in the meetings with your investment consultant, both in terms of investment due diligence and operational due diligence, and just see what questions they ask and see how the asset manager responds, because that is really, really interesting. And I've done that quite a few times, and I think that you learn an awful lot about the understanding of your investment consultant in terms of the technical questions that need to be addressed there, and how they challenge asset managers to demonstrate ESG is properly involved and integrated to how to think about companies. And also then, as we said earlier about asset managers, is your investment consultant signed up to UNPRI? What score do they get? Are the members of various ESG NGOs we all know about? And I'm sorry for using jargon, but this whole industry is riddled with it. But are the members of the Institutional Investors Group for Climate Change? Are they proactive? What do they do? How do they influence it? I think there's lots of questions you can ask and get understanding of how they approach this.
Yeah, can I add something, Kerry, to that?
Please.
Because I think, because I meant to say and I forgot, but you know, I think as in many things, what's really important, and we hold this true to ourselves, is what I call the 3 A's. You know, you have to be in this space in particular, because things are moving all the time and we have to stay abreast, is the 3 A's: authenticity, agility, and adaptability. And we need that from our investment consultants as much as we need it from ourselves. I just wanted to add that.
Great. And also going back to your previous point, Denise, around the asset managers, I would have thought that when you're in the procurement stage or the evaluation stage of your investment consultant provider, you would want to be looking at the, you wouldn't want to just be seeing the responsible investing arm of the investment consultant in the room to answer those questions.
Well, we're very much in the room ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, because we design the process with alongside some consultants, and we work very closely with them in designing that. And sometimes we have different investment consultants helping us with the due diligence rather than the design of the process. So, but we're very much in the room because we want to see the whites of the eyes of the people we're going to be in partnership with for the next decade or beyond.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't mean of the asset management procurement, but when you're looking at your investment consultant, that when you're asking these tricky questions, that you're not getting the responses from the ESG.
Oh yes, yes.
Side.
Well, like again, we it's the same. It's the same. That applies to all our service providers, whether it's you know, whether it's custodians or our ACS provider. We really look at all those good corporate citizenship characteristics that we would expect from everyone we deal with, really, not just our asset managers, but our consultants and our service providers.
Yeah.
But we have to change the whole economy. If we want to change the real economy, it can't just be adapting our portfolios. That's not enough, you know, because we can't disinvest from the climate. It's there, you know, even if we don't have, it's still, we have to change what lies beneath. And that requires everyone to be a participant in changing the world, not just us.
Yeah, that's fully agree. And interestingly, our DB scheme doesn't hold equity at all now. It's well funded. It holds corporate bonds and sovereigns. So our DC is different. So our main influence on companies in DB space is engagement. It's not voting. It's engagement. And making sure that they are aligned with what we are trying to do. And that means focusing on your asset managers, making sure they're engaging with the companies that they're holding on your behalf. Even if they don't have a vote, you've still got to engage. because as Denise says, you can't disengage from the climate. And sometimes I think the asset managers and overlay providers get a bit focused on voting and stewardship because there's an annual cycle and there's an AGM to vote at. But you've got to remember, as corporate bondholders, you have influence on the companies that you invest in, and it's important to exercise that.
And I suppose you would bring in what you mentioned earlier, Brian, around, was it the matrix cards that you would then be assessing the progress that the asset managers have made around their kind of active engagement stewardship side? Yeah,
so going back to the original question, how does it change how we engage with asset managers? We're using those cards now to target engagement with asset managers. How do they engage underlying companies? What criteria do they use to justify the engagement they're participating in, because everyone's got limited resources? And what does success look like? And if success not been achieved, what does that mean? And so it's more outcome focused, and I think that's the way regulators are moving. We've seen the UK stewardship code signatory process caught a couple of fund managers out earlier in the year, because it was not just process we were being evaluated on, it's outcomes. And I think we're moving towards an outcomes focused engagement regime, because we need asset managers and we need underlying companies to progress towards net zero. And we've only got, well, we have to have carbon emissions in the next 10 years. We're living in an outcomes focused regulatory regime now, and we need to align the governance to measure that and assess how well we're doing against those targets.
Yeah, that's a really good and valid necessary point, Brian. Denise, sorry, Denise.
Well, I was just going to add to that you know, it just illustrates how we really need to work in partnership with one another across the whole spectrum. And you know, we have an accord with each of our fund managers that outlines the behaviors we will have with one another, which has been working really well so far. You know, we had one occasion where we had to say to a fund manager, we put them on watch because they weren't where we wanted them to be on ESG, and we had specific milestones that we wanted them to change. And good for them. They knew their relationship with us was a little bit at risk. They had to do some work to improve that, and they have. And now they're not on watch anymore. And so, you know, it's a small incremental step, but the importance of partnership cannot be underestimated. And it may mean that we start thinking differently about profits and market share and, you know, everything that we've all been trained to think about. We're certainly starting to look at things differently. More outcomes focused, as Brian said, not outcomes, just financial outcomes, but social outcomes, outcomes to make the world a better place and a safer place.
Yeah, and on that point, Denise, is there anything else you'd want to add on the next steps, so to speak, for Brunel on you know, honing this relationship, this engagement you have with your service providers on these issues?
Well, you know, we have a lot. You know, we do genuinely feel that it's all about partnership, and I think they feel that as well. So we recently, for instance, we collaborated with FTSE Russell to launch some Paris-aligned benchmarks, which we then subsequently worked with LGIM to launch a £3 billion climate fund, which is linked to those Paris-aligned benchmarks. And, you know, we wouldn't have been able to do that without FTSE Russell and LGIM, and they wouldn't have been able to do it without us. And that's, you know, that's quite big. I mean, from a personal point of view, and my CEO felt the same way. We just thought, wow, this is great that within 4 years of existence, we're able to launch a climate fund that's linked and aligned with Paris. That's, you know, really, really good. And we're going to be doing a lot more of that. The other significant thing that I think is coming down the road is this alignment for passive, because there's so much investment in passive that you know, we need more integration of those Paris-aligned benchmarks for passive portfolios. And I think that's just, you know, we've only just hit a little tiny tip of the iceberg on that so far. So I think there'll be some pretty big changes. But as I said before, it's not just about portfolios. It has to go much deeper than that.
Yeah, Yeah. And your both of your earlier point about the peer kind of influence and the sharing of the network. So you are both members of the, or Russell as your chair, Brian, are members of the Asset Owner Network, and this is really very much about an informal, safe space to share, to ask questions, to explore and stuff like that. So the more that peers are able to do that, who are, who have discovered parts of the journey that they're ahead of, being able to share that with others is really going to be a step forward on this.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I fully agree. The more I speak to asset managers in this space, the more I realise that everyone's learning together. And it's the old adage, but it's always true. There's no such thing as a daft question. No one knows the answers to these questions. Whatever sides of asset manager you speak to, they are still grappling with the complexity of this. And the more you go into the detail, the more complex it is. And trying to build climate risk dashboards in terms of what metrics do you use, how do you budget for it, is it going to be a linear process? These are all very complex questions, and we're not competing with each other here. We're all working towards the same objective, and I fully endorse what Denise said earlier about cooperating and working together, because it's a win-win scenario.
And also it's about, embracing innovation. Einstein didn't rely just on data when he invented the light bulb, but he had a lot of accidents along the way. He failed and he failed better, and we're all in the same way, and as I'm going to come back to Kissinger, because I think he comes out with some good one-liners occasionally, where in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And so we're all a little bit blind, but we know where we want to go. We have a clear target. We want 1.5 by 2050. So how we get there may not be a straight line. We may not have all the data, but we have to be innovative and change our thinking and the mindset. And I have to applaud what A4S has done, because, the Asset Owners Network started 4 years ago. And look at what's happened since then. You've developed this toolkit. There's so much that people can use from A4S to help bring themselves along the journey, irrespective of where they may be. So I'm full of optimism, but with a cautionary element to it that, it's going to be a rocky road, but the momentum is there, and no one's going to stop that momentum, because we can see what's going to happen down the line if we don't tackle climate change aggressively now.
Yeah, I fully agree on that. Just conscious of time, I think maybe I'll hand over to Joe to see if there's any questions from the floor that want to ask Denise or Brian.
Thank you, Kerry, and thank you, Denise and Brian. That's very helpful. I think we're the audience are kind of, you've got now the starting pistol of the spire. Please drop your questions through to the chat. We can roam a little bit as well. So if you've got a question that's kind of been sitting on your intro for a while that you want to ask the guys, feel free. I'm going to take my chair's prerogative and ask you a question. I'd be interested. We've talked a lot about how do we manage our external stakeholders, the people that we're going to rely on and work with. I'm interested, how do you operationalize your philosophy within your fund? You guys have been thinking about it for a while. You've developed it. There'll be a bunch of people out there who are in the kind of less mature space. How do you go about doing that? I'll start with you, Brian, and I'll come to Denise, and Kerry, I'll ask you how the toolkit can help with that too in a second.
So trustees don't live in this space day to day, and I respect that. And I think one of the key lessons that I've learned is training decision makers. Examine the pros and cons of what you're trying to do, what objectives you set yourself, and what metrics you're going to use. And then you go into that journey open-minded. Because when you set objectives and you set metrics and you set reporting obligations, it all has to be aligned. And that's difficult because the world's moving very, very quickly. And that to me is one of the key tasks before you embark on anything, is to get that grounding in what we're trying to achieve here, and speak to your asset managers and speak to your consultants and use the knowledge that's there to inform the framework that you build around your objective setting. And then everything else, it's complicated, but it's second order. I think that to me has been the lesson that I've learned from various schemes I've worked with at different times in my career.
Thank you, Brian. Denise?
I'm not sure I understood the question correctly. Do you mean in terms of how do we integrate it within ourselves? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, how do you integrate it within yourselves?
Yeah. Well, right from the starting point, it has to be, when we're hiring board appointees, ESG has to be creating fire in their belly. If it isn't, there are other people who for whom it does. And we did a recent staff survey, and our young, our staff are quite young, and they really care about this. And in a recent staff survey, 100% of them were proud to be working for Brunel because of our investment philosophy. So, it is there, and we even push it to our IT providers, are all the way down the chain. The people who bring the fruit in the office, how are they sourcing it? What's the so we think about it, and I think that at the moment, where we are right now, it's very positive because everyone is on this, is looking at it through the same lens, and that allows us to speak with one voice. And our underlying funds increasingly are, they've all signed up to the same climate policy, and of course we have the Environment Agency as one of our clients who have been leaders on this for years. It is just an integral part. So we're lucky we don't have. But in other areas where, it certainly has come up on the agenda, and I think now, when new trustees come on board, that's part of the check. Do you care about this? Do you care about the environment, and do you care about the future of the planet? So it's changing. It's all changing, and it's in some places it's changing more slowly than others, but the trajectory is the right one.
Thanks, Denise. I saw an interesting tweet yesterday from somebody who said, if I came in, I guess, from Mars, it was pretty much the implication, and looked at the pension sector, I would only think it was only doing ESG things. That was kind of its core purpose. It's something I've heard from other trustees and other groups too. I just be interested. You can do this, and you can do everything else, right? You're not making hard choices, and if you are, how do you trade off those elements?
There's definitely a governance question in terms of resource, but I remember being at M&S pension scheme when back 2008 or 9, when we signed up to Hermes EOS and signed up to UNPRI, and consultants really weren't in that space yet. But our overriding principle was, let's make this business as usual, and let's stop defining fiduciary responsibility to be a narrow traditional definition of financial risk and financial risk only. It's wider than that, and the world's moved away from that narrow definition, and we're now obligated to think about ESG risks as financial risks. And so I don't see it as being something different from day-to-day business as usual activity. I just see it as integrating a wider definition of risk management into what you do. And that's what we're trying to inculcate with our asset managers and our investment consultants. And we're all in this journey together. And so to me, it's not either or. It's a necessary part of risk management and a wider definition of financial risk. We know transition risk is happening. We know physical risk is happening. And if you own real assets, they are exposed to physical risks because of climate change, which we're seeing already, and therefore, how can it be different from business as usual risk management? I don't personally understand that dislocation.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I entirely agree with you, Denise. Sorry.
Well, you know, I was reading JP Morgan's long-term market assumptions for 2022, where they were investigating whether it's possible to invest both ethically and profitably, and they found three key things: that it was possible to, there's no meaningful trade-off between doing good and doing well when investing in public markets, and that they should that investors. The second thing was that investors should optimize those ESG leaders or improvers within any asset class, rather than choose asset classes that have higher ESG scores, so that it becomes endemic rather than something that's positioned as such, and that they should target an ESG opportunity set that's as broad as possible, including in private markets. So to me, that question is you know, that person from Mars is not getting the nuances, maybe because their use of English is not too good yet. I don't know.
They're an alien.
Alien, yes.
Thanks. We've got a question from the floor, but Kerry, I'll give you a chance to kind of come in on this point if you want to.
Just on the also thinking about how you drive that board consensus. You know, you have to get your board on board first of all, and so one of the parts of our toolkit is our ESG Maturity Map, which is, we have been we road tested this with our asset owner network members earlier in the year, to go to their board, and then they could bring in their exec office and their service providers if they wanted to. And the idea is that they would do a workshopping of the maturity map to see where they think they are on their kind of embedding of ESG into their strategic and investment decisions, and where they actually are, and then bringing in their service providers for them to do the same kind of test, and then and see where the correlation is, or where the differences are. And the feedback that we've got from our asset owner network members has been a very positive one in the practical use of this to help get the realization around the board about what they need to do, and also to focus on the priority areas that they really want to look at. So it's a small plug to our toolkit, which obviously is free to use, but it's a very practical. It's not just you know, lots of guidance. And I have to say that the toolkit is designed for chairs and trustees. So bearing in mind, you know, your time poor, resource stretched. So it is very kind of bringing out the salient points. It's to complement more granular stuff like the IIGCC is work. So I would say that this is a very practical and tangible thing that you could get your heads around and work with your board on.
Well, Kerry, we did it. We did the roadmap with the board, and it threw up some alarming results for us that were quite humbling for the non-execs in particular, because we could see some areas where the execs were at a different place to the non-execs in terms of where they were on their journey. So that meant that we did some more training to try to bring us all to the same place. I think it's a really good, and it doesn't take a huge amount of time. I think it was a few hours, you know, to do it. But it did help shape our priorities for sure.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's helpful if you can get someone who's not exec or non-exec to challenge the thinking as well. Mm-hmm. Just so there's no conflict of interest and people, you know, patting each other on the back. Just to be brutally honest, this has got to happen, and you got to challenge groupthink within the trustee exec community as well. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think you all may have had a sneaky look at the question. But it works incredibly nicely. You know, is there a near-term action that you would recommend? Obviously, one of those is have a look at the toolkit, possibly set some time aside to use it. But is there anything else that you guys would recommend for a trustee group to just get started right now on?
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm doing a plug for the A4S here, but I think
I'll pay you later.
that toolkit is a really good place to start. But the other thing you could do is just have a conversation amongst what does this mean for you? How important is this for you as a trustee? And just an open dialogue, and see where people are and what they need to get them along the way. And that may mean some training. There's lots of training available, but again, there's loads of it on the top tips. That I'm giving you another plug, Kerry. So there's double your fee.
I'm going all red.
But the toolkit, the top tips is a really good one as well. So there's lots out there. And again, I'm sure you are the same. Everything that we're doing is on our website. Have it, use it, do whatever you like with it. Because some of it is okay. It's not bad.
Yes, that's Brian.
And maximise the experience of your immediate community, which will be your consultants and your asset managers, because the asset management community has moved so far in the last 10 years that it is remarkable. And I remember about, pick a number, but 15 years ago, being recommended asset managers that didn't vote shares because they didn't have the resource to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
That's incredible now, right? Now, asset managers without a net zero target are now in the minority. So their thinking's moved on. They employ people in this space to do this. So learn from those you're paying fees to manage your assets, and understand what journey they're on, and does that align with where you want to be? And all that knowledge is there, and it's free because you're paying for it already. So maximise it and utilise it.
Thanks, Brian. Kerry?
Pardon? Sorry, was that me?
Sorry, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think Brian and Denise captured it all. Or I suppose for chairs particularly, offering the asset owner network, which is as I said, an informal space. We use the Chatham House rule for chairs to come along and discuss. So if there are any chairs that are interested in joining, then they can reach me via you on that. But no, nothing more to add.
Okay, thank you all. We are pretty much coming to time, so we won't have any more time for questions today. I've got a whole host of questions. I think we could kind of go on all day. I suspect we'll probably have more sessions, and we'll explore this in more depth in all sorts of ways. But I wanted to say thank you very much to Kerry. Thank you very much to Denise. Thank you very much to Brian. The session will be available on our website online, and some of the content will be circulated to you all separately following the meeting. I hope you found it helpful. I always learn something new in any of these sessions. There's so much for us all to learn in this space and continue to develop. But thank you all so very much.